With me, your host journalist, Luis Alberto Pino. Connecting East and West is an initiative by East Consulting, the leading business and legal advisory firm, bridging businesses between Asia and Latin America. Connecting East and West is your monthly space dedicated to bringing helpful ideas and high-caliber views on the business landscape of these two regions. Connecting East and West by East Consulting is your partner to connect and get the most out of both worlds. And I'm sure you are going to enjoy the next 25 minutes of conversation with Margaret Myers. Hello, Margaret.
Hello, so glad to be here.
Thank you. It's great to have you here. Margaret is the Managing Director of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University. And she's also the Director of the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Margaret is also an Associate Researcher at the Millennium Nucleus on the impacts of China and Latin America and the Caribbean, which is an interdisciplinary initiative that seeks to address China's rise as a main economic partner and the concomitant increase in its political influence on the political agendas of these countries. So pretty much one of the most remarkable experts on Latin America and the relation of the Latin America with China in particular. Thank you, Margaret. So let's begin by talking about some geopolitics. You are special and expert on geopolitics. The China-U.S. relation, I mean, we know it's like a roller coaster right now, right? With multiple ups and downs, at least until they don't achieve an overarching agreement, especially on trade, right? So against this backdrop, Margaret, what role do you foresee for LATAM? For example, do you foresee opportunities for the region as the two superpowers try to strengthen their presence and leverage, their influence across the region? Do you see opportunities, out of this context of tensions between China and the U.S. in Latin America?
I mean, this is a terrific question, and I think it's one that's on all of our minds that we're trying to get at with data analysis and also just observationally, right? I mean, so I think the short answer is yes, right? And this is a bit of an upheaval, right? Or maybe a bit is underestimating, right? We are seeing in many cases an effort to rewrite systems of global economic governance. We are seeing a massive shift in U.S. engagement globally, right? We are seeing also a rethinking in China about how it will be continuing to promote its own economic growth, even at moderate rates, and also a rethinking about how it should position itself globally amid, this new moment of shifting dynamics and the new role that the U.S. is setting. Or course that the U.S. is setting. So disruption, right, is the word of the day and of the month and indeed of the year, right, at this juncture. That can be challenging, obviously, for many regions as they look to navigate this moment. And certainly we see countries across Latin America grappling with this in dramatically different ways, both from a political perspective and an economic one. At the same time, right, these disruptions have already, we see evidence of trade diversion, right, both in terms of exports, right, Latin American exports, and in terms of imports, right? So we see China importing a wider variety of things to Latin America because in many cases it cannot export to the United States, and there are barriers elsewhere in the world to Chinese exportation as we see more of it globally. But also more opportunities for Latin America, certain Latin American countries, really depends on what it is that's being exported to export to China and other markets as they reevaluate and readjust. At the same time, right, we are seeing a moment.
And are you seeing, Margaret, that the Latin American countries are taking the opportunity, are seeing these opportunities right now? What are you seeing? What are you seeing now?
I think so, yeah. I mean, certainly in terms of trade diversion, right, there have been many efforts. Brazil is one that really stands out in this respect, right, to deepen ties, to open more markets, to facilitate more in the way of exportation. And it's a long process and a complicated one navigating China's phytosanitary, measures and the wide-ranging, steps that one needs to take to make this happen. But certainly there are countries that are working on the ground in Beijing and elsewhere in China, right, to make this happen and to facilitate more in the way of engagement. And this is largely in response to this new reality, right, and a shifting dynamic. And on the other hand, right, you see Argentina, which is taking a completely different, approach, and one that would appear at the very least to try to align, in a deeply politically with the United States, in pursuit of financial support from the US, which may or may not be forthcoming, right? But then at the same time, managing this relationship with China from an investment perspective. And as we know, having tracked this very closely, China is a major investor in Argentina, not necessarily to the same degree, especially in terms of annual flows, right, as other nations, but certainly in sectors of critical economic importance from a growth perspective, to include mining and specifically lithium mining. So this is something, I mean, it's a case by case basis, and even within countries, we see dramatic variance, right, at the local level. So states, provinces taking their own positions, right, on how to navigate this course.
In which countries do you see that? I mean, those differences at the local level.
Primarily those that have federalized systems of governance, right? So,
Okay,
and that are
Argentina
big.
and Brazil.
Argentina,
And
Brazil,
Mexico,
exactly.
maybe?
Those are Mexico, absolutely. Those are the ones, the bigger ones, right, where these states or provinces really represent very large economies in their own right. They have, in many cases, decision-making authority in their own budgets, right, and so have been able to chart in most cases, their own course, or to develop their own sort of particular relationship with China or certain Chinese actors. That's not to say that will continue forever, right? Or that the sort of autonomy that they've experienced will be something that will continue into the future. At the moment, in some of these countries, there is discussion about, centralizing some of the decision making related to Chinese investment, and that may reduce somewhat their ability to make these decisions.
And do you think that that's going to happen actually in some cases in Brazil, Argentina, these countries?
It's a good
Are you,
question. I mean, further, it's less likely in Brazil at this particular juncture. In Argentina, though, maybe from a sector specific perspective, there are debates underway, right, about how to manage more effectively the lithium sector, the lithium industry, to extract maximum benefit for Argentina. And certainly the model right now, which is province led, has been one that has generated considerable opportunity, right, for these provinces, that has really prompted expansive investment in these industries, but one where, the deal making may not be as advantageous, right, to the country as a whole, or even to the provinces. Perhaps it could be. So that's where this debate is originating from. Whether this changes dramatically or not is another question entirely, but these debates are certainly underway.
and then just focusing on China right now, and its efforts to strengthen its links with Latin American countries, under this umbrella of the South-South cooperation, right?
Yeah.
There was a summit not long ago, just I think it was in last July, a South-South summit and the BRICS, right, in Brazil, and do you think that China, assigned is leveraging its soft power in the region? It's taking advantage of this South-South cooperation and for example, the BRICS organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think China has been very adept at setting forth an agenda, right, that comes across as enormously inclusive of all countries, right, to include those in the global south. And that has resonated very deeply, I think, across regions, more in some countries than others, but nevertheless, I think there's an appreciation in much of the global south, right, for China's efforts to work with countries in pursuit of certain common objectives. The extent to which these objectives, advance in is another question, and one that needs careful consideration, monitoring, and research, right? But certainly there's a view of China in many cases as a partner in pursuit of common objectives that the Global South has outlined for many, many years, right? And so that can include, reforms in the systems of global governance, which many in the Global South, view to be not as inclusive as they ought to be for these countries, right? Rethinking, certainly, rethinking the international monetary system and dollar dominance, right, is something that has come up across the board. In Latin America, it's been a topic for a long time, but in other parts of the world too, this is something that is being challenged, and organizations like the BRICS this is part of their platform. So I think in many cases it's a messaging campaign, right? And it's been very effective and has indeed improved or fortified China's soft power and image in many of these regions. On the other hand, um, what I think is driving so much of this partnership is not necessarily these views of China or the narrative that China is putting forth, but rather a very pragmatic understanding of what China can and cannot bring to bear in support of development objectives on the ground. And certainly in Latin America, that's the case. Decision making at the policy level is enormously pragmatic.
Well, okay. China, let's talk about trade now. China currently ranks as South America's top trading partner and the second largest for Latin America as a whole, right? Just after the United States. In 2000, this is quite amazing. In 2000, the Chinese market accounted just for more or less 2% of Latin American exports, but now is obviously the most important trading partner for South American countries at least. How do you foresee the trade relation between Latin America and China moving forward, and against the backdrop of the geopolitical feud with the United States and other tensions worldwide?
Yeah, this is an absolutely critical question. My sense, so I mean, the China-Latin America economic dynamic is marked by both continuity and change, right? And so in many ways, we're seeing a continuous process. So, a lot of the same trends that we've seen over the years. So a lot of exportation from the region, right? Now it's more, but a lot of exportation for the region of primary commodities, and we're talking about non-processed, right, primary commodities. No real industrial upgrading or no upgrading really associated with this. That's not changed all that much, right? There are some services being exported to China and other things, and there is some movement in certain sectors, and that's important to note. But in general, the trend is this, right? And then on the other hand, you have China exporting, now it used to be low end manufacturers, and now we're talking about the highest possible end manufacturers. One can imagine. I mean, everything from high speed trains to ultra high voltage transmission lines to ICT equipment to, I mean, you name it, right? We all have seen all of the examples of these things in Latin America, EVs. So, this is a dynamic that we've seen, this sort of asymmetry in the relationship, and that hasn't fundamentally changed. What we're seeing now is, yes, I think more opportunities, in part because of the shifting global trade dynamic, right, for exportation to China of potentially a wider variety of goods and services, but it will be incumbent on, right, the onus will be on Latin American countries to make that happen. It's not going to happen naturally, right? This is not something that China is necessarily demanding from Latin America. So it's using any point of leverage to ensure that this relationship is more balanced. On the other hand, what we are seeing, and this is really critical to note, is more exportation, right? More exportation across the board. This is global, but certainly and you look at the graphs and it's really quite striking. And it's not just of high-tech goods, it's of low-tech goods too. So it's a view of the Latin American market as fundamental to China's trade objectives, right? Export-related objectives. And that is a very big part still of China's growth strategy. So whether this presents opportunities for Latin America or not, whether these goods that are being imported can be leveraged in support of development objectives, all of these are critical policy questions for Latin America. And then another question related to this is whether Latin American countries are going to be able to absorb, right, these increasing exports in various forms. I mean, at a certain point, is there a tipping point? And that is something I think we're all going to be needing to pay attention to in the coming months.
Okay, so I'm talking about opportunities and tipping point, Margaret. I mean, supply chains. I mean, supply chains have been pretty much on the table at least since the pandemic, and I would say even before, since President Trump's first term at least. Do you foresee any actual opportunities for Latin countries out of supply chain relocation, for example? In my view, it's not clear that we are seeing, a massive nearshoring process or the like
Yeah.
benefiting Latin America, which seems to be the case indeed in some Southeast Asian nations. But in terms of Latin America in particular and supply chains, do you foresee any actual opportunities for Latin America?
With respect to the US or
But with
China or
no, with supply chains, no, with
just
respect
in
to supply
general?
chains or
Yeah.
relocations, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, so unfortunately, yes, this was a very big, as you mentioned, right? This was a very big part of the narrative during the first Trump administration and also under the Biden administration, right? There was an effort, a really concerted effort to think through how to incorporate certain industries, right, in Latin America in hemispheric supply chains, as part of a diversification away from China, right, efforts to securitize supply chains in many ways. And so there was a focus on critical minerals, there was a focus on medical um, products, right, all kinds of different things that have some national security sort of dimension to them, and really efforts to think through how to make this happen. Intel in the United States was very big and active in trying to think through this and, approached certainly, Costa Rica was part of this equation. Unfortunately, it will not be anymore, right? Brazil, there were a lot of efforts to engage Brazil in certain, chips within the chip supply chain, right? Primarily in packaging, perhaps also in research and development. And so there was a momentum. And unfortunately, I think at this juncture, right, the story is not a nearshoring one; it's a reshoring one. It's
Okay.
bringing everything home. And there are many in Washington that are suggesting that that is not the answer, right? That really this needs to be a very big part of the equation. So we'll see how far those conversations go, but certainly this is still being debated. On the China side, I mean, this has been part of the conversation with China for years, right? Back in 2015, 2016, China introduced something called the 1+3+6 policy, right? Which was, I mean, I won't go into what all the numbers represent, but essentially it was a policy that suggested that industrial capacity was fundamental for Latin America and that China was going to facilitate more in the way of that development. If we look historically now at the track record, it's not really happened in the way I think that many would have hoped, right, or anticipated. Some industries have developed and grown as a result of Chinese engagement, absolutely. But in general, what we're still seeing is, a reliance on primary commodities, on agriculture, on extractives, right, and not a lot of upgrading within those particular industries, and certainly not an effort to incorporate so much of what Latin America is doing within the supply chain, aside from at the very, very lowest levels, right? So the importation of the raw materials, which are then processed. And lithium is a perfect example of this, right? There have been many promises made, right, to build factories in the southern, well, specifically in Argentina, but I think also some talk in Chile of this, right? And so, but that
Absolutely.
hasn't happened, right? So it's still importation of the rawest of raw materials and then the processing happening in China. For obvious economic reasons, it's just very low cost there.
Okay. Now let's talk about investment, Chinese investment in the region. You pointed out in I think the latest report from the Millennium Nucleus on the impacts of China in Latin America. You pointed out the fact that in 2010, the average Chinese investment in South America amounted to approximately 1.2 billion. And since then, the annual average project size has fluctuated between 200 and 800 million dollars. And this trend, according to your own analysis, towards smaller average transaction sizes is reflective of an apparent shift in focus from high-profile mega projects toward smaller,
Yeah.
more focused investments. What, in your view, are the drivers of this trend? Is there any underlying reason connected with, let's say, China's shift in economic priorities in the region and maybe worldwide?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think what's critical for your audience and really for all of us to understand, right, is that the Belt and Road Initiative in China's foreign policy and foreign economic engagement is completely dynamic, right? It is not static. And the Belt and Road Initiative of 2015 and 2016, when we saw booming infrastructure development, a lot of new announcement of projects, right? Some of those materialized, some of them did not, but all of this large scale infrastructure, this is a relic in many ways, right? This is not the BRI of today. And so, as you've noted, we've seen a dramatic shift in the types of projects that China is pursuing away from these big, large scale infrastructure projects, which are enormously risky, right? Take a long term time to get a return on investment, and in many ways are not the priority for China's economic planners in the way that they were back in 2015. Now China sees smaller investments in high tech, innovative related sectors, right, as being fundamental to upgrading China's productivity, upgrading China's overall economy, right, and ensuring moderate rates of growth well into the future in ways that these large scale infrastructure projects weren't doing. They did serve a purpose, right? They offloaded a lot of excess capacity in steel, a lot of excess capacity in construction, right? All of these things that China still is grappling with. But the shift is really quite dramatic, and it's based largely on a different view of how to achieve China's economic objectives at home. And so that's a really big reason why we are seeing so much of what is happening at this juncture.
Oh, something. Are you still there, Margaret?
I'm still here. I'm sorry. I got a
Yeah.
call and I got turned off. Apologies.
Okay. So, but I guess, I mean, all this shift in Chinese investments in Latin America brings, bring opportunities as well for Latin American countries. Um, so in that regard, are you saying that in our countries we're taking the appropriate steps to take all these opportunities that are brought by these new investments from China? I mean, in these sectors that you just mentioned.
So I mean, I think it really varies across countries. What we are seeing really across the board is a clear trend toward more in the way of smaller targeted investments in very particular high-tech strategic sectors. And this is not specific to South America. We see it also in Central America and Mexico. And it varies a little bit across countries in terms of what's being invested in, what's being exported, and a lot of these investments are indeed market seeking. Whether this is something that benefits countries or not will require a really strategic plan, right? I mean, planning on the part of Latin American governments, thinking through what types of exports, right, are going to be most promoting of certain objectives, whether it's electrification of fleets, right, or thinking through, the use of renewable energy technologies and how to incorporate those in the grid. All of this sort of planning, right, that Latin American countries are kind of going to have to do. And so it's a matter of coordinating these planning, or working with planning ministries and then thinking through what really it is that countries need from China before, striking all of the deals, right, that are coming in and welcoming every sort of high-tech export. And so if the demand is there, then that works, right? It's when we're seeing some countries express concerns about dumping or just a sort of inundación, right? A sort of flooding of goods that it becomes more of a concern. And so there needs to be planning in place. There needs to be thinking, right, about what really can be done with these particular technologies and what cannot, and then also what the implications of these technologies are from a social, environmental, legal perspective. And so many of these high-tech industries, right? I mean, this is all evolving. We're all thinking through this at this juncture, and so this will be a matter of coordinating, I think, with a lot of different countries in the region and beyond to think through the best policies and practices as concerns privacy and other critical questions.
Okay, my last question, Margaret, and I mean, when it comes to Latin Americans investing in Asia, in China, or some other Asian country, what are you seeing in terms of major trends? In the case of China, are you, for example, are you saying that Latin American investors are, taking advantage of opportunities in the so-called tier 2, tier 3 cities in countries like China or some other regions in the southeast part of the continent? What are you seeing in terms of trends?
Yeah, I mean there are a handful of trends that I'm seeing on the in terms of Latin American engagement in China. It has grown right over time as companies become more adept at navigating the Chinese regulatory and economic landscape. Um, and certainly there are opportunities there. I mean, there are a handful of biotech companies in Argentina, for instance, that have made tremendous inroads in China, and there's also some exportation happening to China in very specific industries and sectors. It's still limited, right? Especially in comparison to what's happening in terms of Chinese exports in Latin America, but nevertheless there are, or an investment, right? But there is some movement, and I think more can be done in that respect. On the Chinese side, China and Latin America, right? What I see are three kind of distinct trends, right? One is that we aren't seeing the levels of the flows of capital that we've seen in the past, right? We aren't seeing the
Yeah.
huge financial deals, the big loans. Our investment in general has tapered, right? It's not growing at the same levels that it has in the past, especially if we're talking about mergers and acquisitions. Those are declining in value. But that's largely due to another trend, which is a focusing, right? So really focusing on very particular strategic sectors of interest, most of them innovation related, also mining, and mining especially of critical minerals, right, to support these industries. And so that's another trend. So it's focusing on often smaller projects of less value in dollars, right, but which are achieving certain objectives and also can be market seeking, so they can be facilitating more in the way of exportation. And then finally the last thing we're seeing is localization. And this is, I mentioned before, but so much of the deal making is no longer happening in capital cities, right, within the national government and related ministries. It's happening at the local level. And so the implications of that are multiple and need to be considered when thinking through policy to manage the China-Latin America dynamic and other countries' dynamics, right?
Okay, well, we come to the end of our conversation, Margaret. As always, plenty of information and insightful analysis from you. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it so much. I mean, our conversation. And to all of you, don't miss out our next episode, in which we will continue to explore the business landscape between Asia and Latin America and the opportunities. Thank you so much, Margaret. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.